It doesn't get better
Damn it.
later.
Damn it. All right. Well, we just, for those listening, we I realized I should be recording because we're halfway down this conversation of tipping points. So, but now we have to recreate this, Aaron, for
No problem. But this is what, so let's just stop for a second. So what Chris was saying is it's too late. We shouldn't record, right? We should just get, and my view on that is, it doesn't get better later. It's not like we wind up through the entire conversation. And then what? The whole hour is gone. We haven't recorded anything. So, it's a sunk cost fallacy, really, if you want to get the cognitive biases, right? And we're going to talk about this, but that is the sunk cost fallacy that, oh, I already invested too much, I got to just keep going, versus, no, wait a minute, that was done. We're done with that. Now we're going to go. Like,
fair enough.
A good example, just let me just finish that one thought, is around sunk cost is, my daughter, I was sharing this, is not having a great college experience. She's just not into it. Doesn't, not liking her classes, doesn't see the point. And I don't have any dog in the hunt particularly. I'm not, you got to go to college kind of parent. And, so she's not going to take classes next semester, and she's going to go do whatever she's going to do and, figure out what she wants to do. Right. Better than, not right. And, but she's already got a lease on her apartment, and it's through August, and we're paying for it. We've agreed to pay for it. We've been paying for it while she was at school. And I'm certainly not, well, you're not in school, I'm not paying for your apartment. I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
But the sunk cost fallacy would have you say, if you're trapped in the sunk cost fallacy, you would say, well, you already paid for that apartment. You should stay there. You got to stay in Bellingham until August and use it, because you've already paid for it. You need to stay in Bellingham to use it. And what we were talking about last night was, look, that's already agreed to be paid for, whether you stay there or not. We've already agreed to pay for that. If you want to go someplace else, if an opportunity comes up for you to travel, or something else strikes you as worthwhile and you want to do that, you should not be obligated. Don't feel obligated to stay there till August to wait just to use, to sink more money, more time, more life into it to stay. No, that money is actually gone. We're not figuring that into the future anymore. Now, if you wanted to stay, it's gone. Great. But if you don't, I mean, we're not paying for whatever you're doing next, probably, but you don't need to stay. You don't have to spend good money after bad. So in the recording of this, we want to make sure that, whatever was spent, the time we spent before this was spent before this. Now we're going to recreate the prompt, which is,
well, it was to begin to look at, because I've been playing with how to really articulate a tipping point for people to find, so that in the vortex of vision, which we talked about last week in the last episode, you can move from an essence of something, which in your case, right, when people experience their agency, the world will change. How do we begin to create an infinite game around people experiencing our agency? And so I was sharing with you a couple of the prompts that I'm playing with to see if it helps somebody find their tipping point. And then that's where we kind of went down the road with you and I wrestling with, do we need a tipping point? Like, does it matter that there's a number? And so.
Great. Well, let's just talk about it again. So or not again for the listeners. We should stop saying it again, because here we are. And there's no again anyway. So there's only what shows up now. And now. So the prompt was,
the tipping point prompt was, so if the essence is when people experience their agency, the world will change. The tipping point prompt would be, how does that happen? How do people experience their agency?
Right. Good. And
from where you sit, from what you see.
Yeah, good. And that question is really, how do I see my orchestrating people experiencing their agency? Not the question also could be interpreted, when one experiences agency, how does one do that? And that's not what we're asking. We're asking.
You might, well, it is, I think it's the first, it's how would you orchestrate it? But I think that assumes that you would have an idea about how someone you would need to know how you think someone has it in order for you to create a curated experience for them to have that experience.
Yeah. Good. Good. So yeah,
they're related, but
they're related. Good. They're the right questions. Okay, good. So both interpretations. So first, yeah, I mean, I think when someone operates with agency, with autonomy, they are operating free from in this podcast world, in this world of this conversation, they're operating free from the constraints of GCI units, volume. They're no longer measuring their satisfaction in life by seeing if next year they can do more volume. It's not there's they're outside of that. They're fulfilling something that matters to them like that. And I think that's a valuable thing. And then how do I orchestrate that? It's funny, we just had the conversation. I'm like, well, how do I orchestrate that? Well, first, there's the think globally, act locally phenomenon. So my daughter is a good example, of her having autonomy. Does she feel like she needs to go to school? Is she obligated to finish school because she started? Is it, or is there an autonomous agency? I have to say the direction of my life, and I'm now saying, what, this is not what I'm doing now.
Mm.
How does she have that experience? How does that live for her? Is she empowered to live that way, or does she feel, and worth exploring? Because you don't want to raise a quitter. I mean, I don't. It's how I think about it. So, it's a real question, and it's an exploration, and it's everything that you and I strive for here is not an answer, but asking the right questions and looking on an individual basis.
Right.
So there's the local, like my daughter. Then there's the local, like the buyer that I'm taking out tomorrow, or the seller that I'm helping, right? Yeah. Is in the foreground. The question is what's shaping the dialogue that I'm about to have with whoever I'm having it. It's what's shaping that dialogue, the container, the context. Is this person experiencing agency, their own agency, out of whatever scenario, choice, the situation? Is that a concern of mine in the dialogue? Is it present in the dialogue? Or am I? So I would need to, in terms of how I orchestrate it, I've got to be sensitive to those individual localized dialogues. And then I think it expands from there. Like, we've created this podcast. Mm-hmm. We've created the workshops. Mm-hmm. I think there's bigger and bigger stages that you and I could get on and speak to it, all having the conversation, the concern for people's agency shape what gets said. And what gets created. Then there's podcasts, there's books, there's articles, there's all those different. That's how I can see orchestrating it. So the answer to the prompt is everything I just said.
Yeah, beautiful. Right. Good. And somebody else from a different lived experience could say a different way. They could see people experiencing agency, but what you just said was a way that you see how that would happen.
Yeah.
And I think how I got to this prompt, or this thought about this prompt, was like, how does that happen? Is as the prompt is, if you could, it's sometimes easier to see it in the smaller scale. Like if one of the things I said to you was, like, if 10 people came to you and they're like, hey, Aaron, we really want to learn how to have agency. Right. What would we do for the next year? And so all you had to do, you didn't have to think for your lifetime or an infinite game. You didn't have to think a million members. You just had to think, what would I do with these 10 people to curate an experience for them to practice living from their agency? And I would imagine that in addition to what you just said about all the things, there would be more texture and color. And
if that became then that becomes something of a workshop that falls, I think, in my mind, in the domain of a workshop. 10 people over a length of time. Okay. You could call that a workshop as well as you could call it anything. A mentorship, whatever you called it is fine. And then it would take creating. And I think I think that's the work that we do in the community together. I would like to hear other people's views of that. I'd like to workshop that,
Yeah.
play it out versus come up with some quick answers. Here's the 3 things I could do. And I do have some quick answers for it, but I think the question is more valuable than just coming up with whatever quick answers I have. And I think
Perfect.
doing it in a community is what
Okay.
would shape that.
So, right. So again, love, perfect. I mean, I can hear based on what you value and how you, and the process you think that would really honor agency is maybe some answers as it relates to like positing something into a question or into a conversation, but more importantly, the wrestling with and the inquiry over time is the way you would choreograph or orchestrate something.
Yep.
That how you would orchestrate people finding their agency is people working on it, talking about it, wrestling with it.
Yep.
And so you could see like that structure holds how you think that how you think people would come in contact with and become, I don't know if the word masterful makes sense here, but would be proficient at living from their agency.
Yeah.
That's the process.
Yeah. And the engagement of playing that game,
Yeah.
the commitment that I
Yes.
had to develop that particular game is what the purpose of this community is, for individual
Right.
people to join this community who are committed to discovering their essence, uncovering that, developing that game. I think that then becomes, so I think the prompt is great. In terms of what we started with, like, okay, does that prompt work to develop your tipping point?
Yeah. Well, so, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say that, and that's, I think, where the question came up. Is it critical? At this point, I'm not convinced that it's critical that there be a number on it.
Yeah.
That I don't need 1 million. I don't know that I need 1 million. I might, but I don't know. And I don't know that it's important that I have that for it to be, an infinite game. I think it could be just a stated commitment that at some point the 100th monkey is going to show up.
Yeah.
And I'm going to play until the 100th monkey shows up, until it's so, whatever number it is.
Yeah. 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 I think is there more than one way to climb this mountain? Heck yeah, of course. There are many paths up this mountain. For me, about a number, well, there's before that number, what came up for me about that is, a number means nothing. If I said like, okay, so I can already see the structure you would use to play this infinite game based on how you answered that prompt. Like it would be groups of people. Yep. In this case, we're talking about real estate agents who want to have an impact beyond GCI, the transaction. Right. But I know that your heart doesn't stop there. Like that who you want to experience agency could be parents, leaders in community. Like you have many places that you could copy and paste that structure for others who wanted to play that game.
Yeah.
So then to get to a tipping point, this is why I wanted to do this first, to get to a tipping point is simply to allow yourself to see all the places you would want that structure to be placed. Do you want it to be placed in other places besides real estate?
You're asking me?
I mean, it was sort of rhetorical, sure. But also, yeah.
I mean, the work I do with Landmark is 100% inside that as well. Yep. I got, sorted out if I was going to keep doing that or not, because I was very clear, very little gives you agency more than the leadership immersion programs that I get to lead with Landmark. So for sure, for all people. And then those people then become, that particular expression is those people then become catalysts in life. Right. For the people in their life. So it's a high leverage opportunity for me.
High leverage.
And then there's whatever shows up as next. There's, like I just talked about my daughter. We'll see. There's all. But yeah, so there's for sure not limited to this, but this, my work with realtors is what is sourcing my interest in this podcast and this workshop and what we're doing together is like that. And also I see it as a very high leverage. I mean, we really started this very much, you and I, inside the leverage that realtors possess that they don't take advantage of in their communities to make a real difference.
So, I mean, I'm gonna just to go the it's not a devil's advocate, it's just the opposite end of the spectrum of the question about like, do I really need a number, right? Which is, well, then would it be enough to have one person be in this conversation? Like, let's just have one and be done. Let's just have one. Let's have this conversation with only one. You see, like, I don't know that we get the leverage if we only do it with one. There's a mass leverage here, but
okay, but it's when, so I don't know if this is the essence, when I want to say it the way it's said in the work you've created here. When people experience their agency, the world will change.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the way we're languaging that?
Yeah.
Okay. So then I don't know how many people look. It could be one person. I don't know. Is it the Dalai Lama? Is it, I don't know who needs to get enrolled in it. I don't know who needs to speak it or create it. It's probably more than one, but I don't know how many it is, but if it's when I think you could play it, that game until the world changes. Literally, you could just keep playing it. It doesn't detract from the infinite gameness of it.
Of course.
To have it not have a particular number.
Of course.
And it doesn't keep it from, I think on one hand, okay, here's what it does do. Okay. You got to find other ways to measure it versus the number of people that get, registered for our workshops. You got to find some other way to manage that.
Yeah.
And come up with your own metrics for how, certainly you could have metrics called how many realtors have we engaged in this podcast, how many downloads, how many listens, how many people registered in the workshop. I mean, we could track the increase, right? Because I could say, if I'm just going to keep using my game as the reference, clearly not enough because the world hasn't changed yet.
Right.
And then what does the change in the world mean? I mean, I haven't at all articulated, put no effort into articulating what that even looks like.
Yeah.
How would I know that the world has changed? I mean, it changes every minute of every second of every day. The world has changed. Right. What am I really talking about? I haven't done any intellectual heavy lifting about that at all. Yeah. So that I think that becomes more important than the number on it.
Right. Well, I think
that's my initial thought on it. I haven't.
Yeah. I think for me, that's where I think I've found some benefit in a number is that if you are someone who likes to do stuff, like you don't want to just sit with it forever, but you actually want to be in action around it.
Yeah.
It is helpful for me to have a game to play that has edges. Mm-hmm. Without edges, I can play it today, but I might, there's no future pull for me if I'm like, well, who cares? I mean, you said last week about marathons. So the point of having 26 miles is because it invites you to keep going till you can cross that finish line. Like, who cares if it was 26? When it could have been 18, a marathon could have been 5. Why 26? I don't know. But to me, 26 miles is like a tipping point number. You're picking something because it gives you edges to the game you're playing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, but it's easier to play the game inside the measure you gave yourself.
Totally.
If you like to take action.
It's dynamite, Chris. It's great because there's really both sides of this conversation make sense.
Yeah.
So I think it's good because, I think it's good on a lot of levels. I think it's cool because everything you just said makes total sense and is super empowering, clearly to you. And it's going to speak to a ton of people.
Yeah.
Right. And it's going to make sense to a ton of people, and they're going to hear themselves in that and be empowered to play a game that makes a difference for them.
Right.
And then I like to think everything I said makes sense.
It does make sense. It does make sense.
And
Play
it'll
this game from
speak
either way.
and it'll speak to another group of people for whom the first one didn't speak to.
Yeah.
Right. And give people, see, my edges are just need to be need to be defined, which I haven't defined them. And I think I think inside that there would be goals for, okay, this year, or in the next time frame, iteration of time between now and whenever, between now and December, there's going to be this many people in the workshop, and there's going to be this many people, in that program that I lead, and it's going to be this many. I'm going to write this many books and this many downloads and this many listens, and whatever. My daughter's going to have whatever sorted out by X time. So then I get to invent my own metrics within it. That still doesn't have an end number, but it does have an end vision,
right?
Picture like that. So I think that's good, Chris, because it's the first time I've sorted out that the thing about 1 million never really struck. I couldn't quite resonate with it. I couldn't quite get it, and I hadn't articulated why or why not. And it's important that you fight for, and this is for everyone, this is me talking to everyone, but it's important you fight for sorting out whatever it is that you can't resonate with or don't resonate with until you can articulate it, because there is no answer. There's no, this is how it's done here. So, I mean,
I mean, it's just a framework.
So glad you started recording this, Chris.
I'm so glad you told me to. It's just a framework. It's just a framework.
Yeah.
I think too, that there are, if we talk about leverage for a minute, I mean, there's one of the things I've found is that by having a vision for a certain amount of communities, 1,000 communities, right? Which is how the map I had to get to 1 million was 1,000 communities with 1,000 members in each community. That I had that somehow expanded my conversation with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I started to look for were leaders who wanted to lead a conversation in some vertical that they're in for this kind of work, this kind of conversation. And if I hadn't said, I'm looking for 1,000 community leaders, partners, then I would have stayed at the level of the people I was simply having the conversation with in the trenches of things, and not getting to the leverage of. So what it did was it allowed me to invite more people into the conversation by having a number that, without having that number for me, I don't know that I would have been looking for that.
Really important, Chris. I think what you just said, I think it's so useful, because even in the world that I created versus, as a comparison, even in the world I'm creating, I said, I'm just talking about an end number. Like a number at which the world has changed. I don't know what that number is, but I for sure need some number in a next period of time. There's got to be temporality and a number for there to, there's got to be a 26. There's got to be a 26 mile. There's got to be a 26 mile within a certain time frame. Otherwise there's no game. There's no game unless there's the obstacle. Between here and there's no game unless something that isn't yet is more important than what is right now. Ball and hoop, 26 miles, and there's a game, and there's a way of measuring it, and then there's all sorts of obstacles between here and there. So all that stuff's got to get created. So I think it's what you're saying about 1,000 giving you the future, the life,
the obstacle
to act on and to grow inside of, that would fulfill on it, is as critical in the world that I created as is in yours. I just don't have the end number called 1 million. So I didn't do 1 million, then math, 1,000, whatever. But I do need to create something around either downloads or people in webinars. Some metric somewhere has got to get created. Or there is nothing to call. Otherwise, it's just, and you and I both had this conversation months ago about, otherwise we're just talking on this podcast to each other, and it's a way of our shooting shit, and might as well get a bourbon and hang out and, just smoke cigars and talk.
Yeah.
Which isn't a bad idea anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is something about having, I think it just left. Damn it. Come back to me. Come back to me. I don't know.
All right. Well, I'll talk for a second. We were just see if it comes back to you. Just to recreate that, I do think that inside this conversation that we're creating, it's up to the individual to create their own metrics.
Yeah.
Both the way the future looks, what it looks like when it's fulfilled, how many are you going to need to get there? Now, you may not know the end number, but then you got to get at least very much the next number. You know, what's the next goal for you? And then when you get there, you know, you run a couple of marathons, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to do an ultra marathon because I can do marathons and that's no longer a problem for me. So it's no longer a sufficient obstacle. So I'm now going to do an ultra marathon, you know, or I'm going to do a triathlon. Or, but you don't see the possibility of a triathlon until you've done your first 5K.
Yeah, that's good.
So great. And it may be like a complete joke to you to do an ultra triathlon, you know, like that may be like, yeah, that's like flying to the moon. But so you start with a 5K.
Yeah.
Right. And you would never say an ultra marathon or an ultra triathlon or whatever the hell I call those things. Right. I would never even say that. Doesn't even look good. Fine. Don't say that.
Right.
Right. Say the 5K.
Yeah. Well, I think that's
from there.
Yeah, that's great. That's so good because that's part of what my tipping point is not your tipping point. You know, people coming into this conversation, I think part of what got me to that number was sort of a Gary Keller one thing type of a question, like, you know, the one thing question. What's the one thing such by doing it, having it would make everything else easier, unnecessary in the world I see possible? And I picked a number and then I used that to work myself backwards. But working myself backwards, all I could see. So I did it that way. And then I said, working it backwards today, what's the one thing I could do now? And I'm like, well, I just got to go create my first community. Math aside, I need one. Right. So, but somebody else might say they may not have a vision or a desire to go, I want to run an ultra marathon. They're like, what they could see today, the tipping point for them in this moment, the one thing that would make everything else easier and necessary is if I just ran a 5K. Great. And then you do it and you go, well, then today, what do I need to do today? And then you go do that. And then you get to that summit. And as the old proverb goes, there are mountains behind mountains. Like you get to the summit and guess what? There's
more mountains,
something else. But at least now you have a space you've been playing in and a game that you have muscle memory for.
Yeah.
Like I played baseball in the minor leagues. Now I can play in the major leagues because I have that muscle memory of how to play baseball. I know how to play professional baseball. Let's go further.
Yeah. And that's really, and then all of that, let's bring it together and say what we're building. I hear that's the purpose of this community is to bounce around and I forgot how you said it. You didn't say struggle, but
a wrestle, maybe.
Wrestle.
Yeah.
To wrestle with your ideas until they become something that you can take action on.
Yeah.
And to, brainstorm, create, I don't know, whatever, brainstorm, new ideas, come up with new ways to think outside of how you would normally think, and then look to see what are the appropriate actions, and then, play inside that domain until something else shows up, but do it in a community of people that are all doing it.
Yeah.
That's the opportunity we're out to create.
Yeah. 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 I just have one more thought about metrics, and that is that if you're going to measure something, I think the reason a tipping point as a phrase works for me is that if you said, okay, subscribers was the measure, it was the obstacle of the 26 miles, then you'd really have to, then what I'm inviting for people to look at is, does subscribers fulfill on the essence? And is subscribers really the tipping point for the essence to happen? I don't know that it is, because subscribers come and go. There's no demonstration in subscribing to to the podcast that you are actually in the inquiry of agency.
Okay, let me live with that for a minute.
Well, we can do this at levels, right? So you could say that one level of being in the inquiry is listening to it.
I would say that.
Right. I assume that's why I said that. So then, but to me, if I thought, well, what really makes the difference? To me, the difference, my preference would be that people would wrestle with it. I would prefer people wrestle with it than listen to it. Because I think people can listen to stuff all day and not do shit with it.
Again, and that may be the 5K to the marathon. You gotta, you gotta walk before you can run. You gotta listen to it before you wrestle with it. And so where, you could say, what are the measures that work? You could say how many people are in the work, how many people complete the workshop, right? Or how many people are actively engaged in the workshop as the metric beyond subscriptions. But subscriptions is I'm going to use the F word. If you're building a funnel, it starts with listeners, and then there's participants. So you can measure participants, but you could also measure listeners, knowing there's a particular conversion that people will listen for a certain amount of time, and the X number of people then become participants, and then X number of people will actually have successful projects. And so you could measure. I think it's important to wrestle with what are the right measures. Before you.
That's the point.
Assume that
that's my point.
Okay, good. Well,
is because there are trendy, popular measures that people would use without thinking about it. Does this measure impact the essence of what I'm doing?
Good.
They would just blindly say subscribers because that's popular to say subscribers.
Right. And it's easy to measure, and it's the lowest common denominator. But if you just measured subscribers and didn't measure participants and had no idea, then you would really be missing the boat.
I also think your measure depending on the measure you pick, could lead you to the wrong game. Totally. Right? You're like, hey, my measure is touchdowns, but you're playing baseball. Like, it's not the same. You can't measure touchdowns in baseball. So like if you're saying subscribers, and what you're really after is people having a change in the way they make decisions from.
I think that's a weak metaphor. Because it is the same game. But I think a better metaphor would be something like, this is good. So we can get into baseball, and Moneyball as the idea, for years, pitchers were graded on win-loss record, right? Which is a really weak measure for a pitcher, because a pitcher doesn't have little to do with the win-loss, but has less to do with the win-loss than you would think. Or hitters are measured on their ability to get hits versus on-base percentage. Now, on-base percentage is actually a better measure for the hitters, for the team. How often do they get on base?
Good.
So you're measuring the wrong thing. And when you find the right thing to measure, you have more leverage. So it's not even you're in a different game. It's you're not measuring the highest leverage activity. Right?
Love it. Beautiful. Good. I'm so glad I used a bad metaphor so you could put an awesome one in there. And that's a great metaphor.
So, and I'm 100% in agreement with you that if you measured subscribers and only subscribers, and that was your deal, you could easily wind up down the road of watering down your communication just to get more subscribers and think you're winning the game, because that's what you're measuring is subscribers. So you're not making the difference you want to make because you're not dealing with it. But if you did deal with, now participants in the seminar or whatever it is you're building, and those people and their effectiveness in that, because you could also measure the number of people in the seminar and again, still not make the impact. So you need to have the end of the funnel. There's the F word, end of the funnel metric. And then all the other ones become KPIs for that metric.
Right. Yeah. Well, in defense of my metaphor, I can be right about it for a minute. I've seen people get into content for one reason. Yes. And then they start to notice that reels and shorts are more rewarded by, let's say, YouTube, for example. And so the game, which may have started with substance, turns to entertainment. And so I went from playing baseball to to playing I went from trying to make a difference to trying to be entertaining.
Very good.
Because that's how YouTube pays me. YouTube pays me when I have more view time, and what gets me more view time is removed from my initial intent of the content I was bringing.
Yes.
It is easy to get into a different game altogether. I've seen it. And that's okay but I'm just saying, like, if you want to preserve the essence of the work, then you would want to your point, pick a measure that is leveraged for that end result.
100%. Totally got it. You and I are on the exact same page.
Yeah. Very good.
All right,
Don't
good.
call my metaphors weak.
I did though. It's too late. It's recorded. You'll have to edit it out if you don't want.
It takes me a while to have to figure out why I said it, but anyway.
No, I think it's right. It's good. I'm glad you defended it.
Yeah. Well, what do we make of all this tipping point conversation then? I mean,
I think it's the purpose of I think it becomes then the utility of the workshop and the utility of the community to actually do the work you and I have done today on each individual. And I'm personally excited to hear what other people are dealing with, because I know it'll impact and shape how I articulate, how I express, how I play the game that I'm creating, even shape the parameters of the game that I'm playing to have it be created in community versus just my head or just me and you. And I think, you and I are ready for the community, because that's a bad way to say it. It's not that we're bored with each other, but it's time to have other input into this conversation. It's just time to have more people playing, it's the expression for both you and I, I think that's what we make of this.
Yep. And my thoughts on tipping points just being, whether it's 26 miles or a 5K, that can be your tip, that the point of a tipping point is simply to give you the game to play, from which you can map your way to that 5K or 20 or marathon. And then inside that, start to enact the plan, start to take action take your training steps forward in that work you want to do. So I'm not attached to whether it's 1 million or not, 26 miles or 5K. I don't care.
Right. And it could be, and it doesn't have to have, you don't need to come up with the final answer.
Right.
There's no, it doesn't have to be more than the 5. If the whole thing is for you, 5K is going to be, worth it, great, then let's start there. When you get done with the 5K, we'll see what opens up next.
Well, that's the cool part about infinite games. It's the point of an infinite game is to keep playing. So if what gets you started now is a 5K, and you get to the end of that, you go, hey, I want to lift weights now. I don't even want to do a 5K. Hey, that's cool. You can change the rules in an infinite game. Well, I think you want to preserve the essence of that's why we start with essence, because you want to, preserve what it is you say your life is headed for. Totally. That's exactly right. Really good. All right, man. Good stuff today. That was fire, as the kids say. Oh, look at those kids. All right, brother. See ya. All right, man. Love you.